It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from London, Nico Hines, world editor of The Daily Beast. How are you?
I'm well. Good evening.
Thanks for being with us. Thanks as well to freelance journalist Aisha Gul Sert. How are things?
Good. Alive. Here.
She's alive. She's here. Also here, sitting next to her, Fabrice Rousselot, editorial director for The Conversation France.
Good evening.
How are things?
Very well, thank you.
All right. Freelance photo reporter Amar Abed Rabo is with us as well. How are you?
All good.
All good. Okay, good. By the way, you can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. For 4 days, the world waited on word of that tourist sub and the 5 inside who'd gone to explore the wreckage of the Titanic until Thursday.
This is an incredibly unforgiving environment down there on the seafloor. And the debris is consistent with a catastrophic implosion of the vessel.
Fabrice Rousselot, what's the takeaway from this story?
There are different takeaways. I've learned, for example, that there's absolutely no regulation for those kind of submarines if they are in international waters, so that you can do whatever you want, which seems to be quite incredible. Obviously, the takeaway is that some regulations have to be put in place for those types of expeditions. I mean, if you look at the way they did things, and for the first information we're having from OceanGate, apparently all the conditions of security were not there. There's a discussion about carbon fiber composite that was part of this vessel that apparently doesn't resist pressure very well. I read in the New York Times yesterday or today that even James Cameron had some kind of fear about that on vessel. So I think other than the fact that 5 people were paid so much money for that trip down to the Titanic, I think we have to take away some lessons about regulations, about this, I think it's called frontier tourism, which is kind of extreme tourism where people do extreme things. And if we don't want those things to happen and end up like, in a cauchemar scenario, then we need to do something in terms of regulations.
Yeah, it's ironic that news of their disappearance surfaced the same day, Aisha Gul Sert, that the United Nations approved a treaty of the high seas for the first time. And also a reminder that we've actually been to space more than we have to the bottom of the ocean as humans.
Well, the thing is that money buys anything, but it's very interesting what Fabrice was saying about James Cameron, because James Cameron, before doing the world-renowned director who did Titanic, but he's known for making lots of research before going into any cinematographic projects, so he knows what he's talking about. And I watched the ABC News interview that he gave, and he mentioned 2 things. One, how destiny seems to repeat itself in terms of here is centuries later another ship that goes to seize the wreckage and does become a shipwreck itself in a way. That's the first thing. And the second thing, he said that there's been a lot of writings, actually, a lot of reports that have been sent by the community in order to warn that these types of adventures, expeditions are not fully secure yet. So the warnings have been given, but that's why, in a way, money buys everything, even whether it's the moon, the stars, or the deep down sea.
All right, we'll get back to that money issue and this adventure tourism. You mentioned, both of you, James Cameron, the director of Titanic, who, once the news had come out that all hope was lost, spoke of his doubts about Ocean View's tourist submersible.
A loud bang on the hydrophones, loss of transducer or transponder, loss of comms. I knew what happened. Sub imploded.
Now, the Daily Beast spoke to James Mester. That's a deep water salvage master based in the U.S. state of Washington. He'd been offered a trip aboard the Titan's predecessor, the Antipods, and he said that none of the equipment that I saw inside the submersible was up to that level, so I just chose not to go. Nico Hines, much has been made of the fact that some of the equipment was the kind you find at a home improvement store.
That's right. But I think that might be something of a red herring. I think apparently it's very common to use basic, simple, like controllers and reliable machinery for vessels like this. I actually went on one of the space shuttles in Miami to have a look around. It wasn't going anywhere, I hasten to add. But they made the point that they had deliberately used really old switches, really basic machinery, simple components, because they knew that those components would last over 10, 20 years because they had a long kind of lead time with them. So I think the things that were inside weren't necessarily a problem. Where the problem is that they didn't use that long history of submarine trips. You know, I think the first submarine was going down in something like 1930. So you've got almost 100 years of experience that you can call on. And for almost all of those, they used a steel hull because it's incredibly hard on any material to go to these sorts of depths. And rather than relying on that experience, this guy thought that he could cut a corner, save some money, and, well, we've seen what's gone wrong with that.
Did he cut a corner, Fabrice Rousselot, or was it that he, because he started out as a pilot, thought, I know better?
The thing is, we mentioned earlier, but this is a point we have to make. There's tourism involved. He's not like by himself trying to do stuff and cutting. He can cut corners if he wants to by himself in his little submarine. If you bring in tourists, if you bring in people, and if it's supposed to be a touristy thing, then you have to have some regulations. You have to have some security. So you have 5 people on board. Most of them, paid a lot of money for that. So I mean, I could understand that, he's been justifying his expeditions by saying that money, I use it for scientific research and everything, which is fine. It's interesting, and it's if the only way to go forward, that's fine. But again, if you're bringing tourists to those vessels, you have to be sure that they are safe. You have to be sure that they are in the right components, and you have to be sure that whatever you're doing and all components that don't come from Home Depot, as you said.
All right. The owners of the Titan insist this wasn't thrill-seeking for billionaires. It was bona fide undersea exploration.
The intent of all of these missions is not to conduct joyrides down to this wreck. Everyone who goes down there has extreme reverence for the wreck as a gravesite. And if anything, everyone who goes down there is going there to preserve the memories and to document the gravesite itself.
Amar Abed-Rabo?
What's very ironical with what we saw about James Cameron is that the guy who advised Cameron for this movie, the French ocean specialist or researcher himself,
Paul-Henri Narjolet.
Exactly. He didn't have the doubts that Cameron had, and it's quite ironic to see that. For me, coming from the Middle East, of course, the whole week was about the total difference. Was it in media treatment, but also in means put on the table to get these 5 people, while this is also very ironic or very cruel. The same week, we had this ship in Greece with 750 people on board, and I don't remember the last toll. Was it 500 or 200 dead? But I mean, 100 times more. And of course, it wasn't for hours. Even now, we're discussing this story for 10 minutes. So I explained to all my friends that media have also to do with something rare. This is much more rare, unfortunately, etc. Et but I mean, I understand and I hear the anger of many people who don't get it.
Yeah, the New York Times now reports that the U.S. Navy, using data from a secret network of underwater sensors designed to track hostile submarines, detected, quote, an anomaly consistent with an implosion or explosion in the vicinity of the Titan as early as Sunday. But they insist, Nico Hines, that they weren't certain. And of course, to answer Amar, Nico, the difference is we know everyone's dead on board that overcrowded fishing vessel in the Mediterranean, whereas here some were still holding out hope.
Yeah, I mean, you have to say that the US Navy and whoever it was that made the decision to withhold that information, but also the company itself, because it's actually now become pretty clear, if you read between the lines, that they heard a loud bang over their communications devices at the exact same time that all of the equipment went down and they could no longer get through to them. So they must have had a very, very strong idea of what had happened themselves. And it's absolutely the case that that was what turned this into a several multi-day rolling camera, 24 news, perfect story, because it's very much a kind of Hollywood situation, isn't it? A race against time. We knew we had 96 hours to go. So a lot of TV channels even had literal kind of countdown clocks on the screens. And in fact, people in the know knew all along that the story was already over. So that does leave a slightly sour taste in the mouth, and you wonder about the motivation of those people. Obviously, it's fair enough that the company still wanted to go and check just in case they had survived. But I think pretending that this was an ongoing rescue operation when it wasn't was somewhat disingenuous.
Aishagul, Ellen on Twitter says, by failing to share their data and acting as if they were in a heroic rush against time with oxygen running low, they conned the public and media. Were the families informed?
Well, the thing is, I've lived in the U.S., but especially, particularly in L.A. for a long time. In L.A., we are known for watching for hours and days car chases of a police running for hours after a car. This really reminded me, of course, it's a tragedy, but kind of this. Journalism 101 is what? If a dog bites a human, it's not interesting. If a human being bites a dog, it's interesting. Very unfortunately, what Amar said so rightfully is that we have become accustomed, normalized the fact that there are migrants dying in the Mediterranean for years. And, since I remember, especially since 2015, since the deal was brokered between the EU and Turkey. But the thing is what really caught me and in this story is there have been a lot of tributes that have been paid to this father and son who were in the sub in Titan sub.
Yeah, these scions of a Pakistani billionaire family.
Exactly, and the fact that there have been so many fathers and mothers and children on that boat this week who lost their lives trying to find something else, not for adventure, not in order to see some history wreckage of the Titanic, but in order to be able to find life elsewhere, and who found death, I think is what really should come out of the story, and how we have forgotten in a way our humanity with all this.
Have we forgotten our humanity, Fabrice Rousseau?
To some extent, yes. I think if this tragedy could be used to question the journalism, the way we do journalism today, I think that would be a good thing. And the comparison was made in the French press many times that why spend so much so much resources and so much time on that expedition? Well, the tragedy of the coast of Greece was dealt with in 3 days, and the media just all of a sudden stopped talking about it. So I think if we could think and look deeply at the way we do news and the way we react to those stories, that could be a good lesson from those two tragedies.
Final point on this, that there's also the aspect, and Aishagul mentioned it, that there were billionaires on board, paid $250,000. Ruth on Twitter saying the laws of physics apply to everyone.
Exactly. I mean, Aishagul said money can buy everything, but obviously not. I was wondering in a very human, basic way, in this very, very little space, I think it's twice the table or something like that, when you have 5 people who are more or less having fun or drinking or thinking about what they will see later. I mean, tourists having fun, and then at some point they realize, I don't know if it was very quick or if there's maybe 10 minutes or maybe 10 hours, I don't know, of realizing that they won't be, that the little joystick of a Nintendo cannot bring them back anymore to what happened, how it went. It's quite interesting. Maybe one day we'll see a novel or a movie about these last moments. But I wonder on a very down-to-earth basic. In France, if you go and get crazy a little bit over the mountain and get lost, and then they have to send a helicopter to find you.
There was a famous case a few years ago with those young people in the Alps who went out in a blizzard.
Exactly, and they had to pay a lot of money later for the rescue teams. And I wonder, in this case, where obviously millions have been spent, who is paying for that? Are they American taxpayers? Is that the billionaire's family? Is there an insurance or something like that? These will be maybe next week questions, but it's interesting.
Nico Hines, your religion when it comes to adventure tourism?
Well, I'm certainly not going to be tempted now. I think what is really interesting is if you look at the website of this company, which is one of the first things I did when this broke, was to go and look at the disclaimers. What do they say on the website? And they make a kind of point of almost make it they tried to almost make it sound exciting and adventurous, the fact that it wasn't properly classified, that this ship hadn't been put through tests and approved by any official bodies anywhere. And what they say on there is it's just like SpaceX, Elon Musk's private space exploration company. And I think that's probably where the next story on this comes, because although there might not be that many billionaires queuing up to get into a submarine anytime soon, there certainly will be when it comes to commercial flights to space. And I guess it's only a matter of time before one of those goes kaboom as well. And that time it will be on the cameras.
You have to turn the clock back 2 decades to the Second Intifada. For the last time, Israel used a helicopter gunship against West Bank militants. That's exactly what happened this past Monday in the Palestinian refugee camp in the city of Jenin. The next day, Jewish settlers were targeted at a gas station shooting spree. Israel's most far-right government ever includes West Bank settlers who don't hold back.
The time has come for a military operation in Judea and Samaria. Yes, to return to the targeted assassinations from the air, take down buildings, put up barriers, expel terrorists, and pass the death penalty law for terrorists in second and third reading.
Amar Abed-Rabo, we talk about stories that get coverage and others that don't. This one didn't get that much coverage here.
No, it didn't at all. I mean, we were all busy with other things. It's terrible. And also, as Fabrice said a bit earlier, we got used, or we got, I don't know, vaccinated or insensitive, or I don't know what is the right word, but...
Is it because the tensions have been going up and down for the past few months?
For the past few years, it's never really stopped. Of course, now having a far-right government doesn't help. But we also, not only here, in many other places, that when you do the very tough solution, let's say, when you go destroying the houses, when you go tough on people, etc., it doesn't stop the anger. On the contrary, it makes it even stronger and stronger. And this situation, as long as we are in this tunnel of hatred from both sides, it won't get better, unfortunately.
I do think that one of the key points there is a kind of disengagement from the international community. That's why also there is less coverage. But I have to say that the context today is one of the worst ever. Ironically, the north of the West Bank was seen 10, 15 years ago as some kind of a test, a pilot for disengagement, for maybe the Arab state and so on after the Oslo. And now this is what's happening. But it's happening for two reasons. The first one is on both sides, it's extremists taking over. If you look at what's been happening with the government, Netanyahu's government have been taken hostage by the far right. If you listen to that minister calling for more violence, there is people killing each other. He's calling for a military operation. And on the other side, it's the same thing. The young people don't recognize themselves in the Palestinian Authority. There is nothing there for them. So basically, on both sides, you have extremists taking over, fighting against each other. Each time there is something happening, there's revenge, and so on and so on. And it's building up. And again, the fact that the international community has been looking the other way, except for the UN, calling, this is, let's be careful, which we see all the time. But nobody is looking at it, and nobody's, and since Trump and other people decided that they wouldn't solve that issue and they don't want to get into that mess anymore, then yeah, it's been totally overlooked.
And in the international community, I should assert we can include neighboring Arab states who'd rather.
That's true, but we should definitely and mostly include the U.S. I think the U.S. has been greatly failing in its diplomacy and policy in regards to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. I think also that, we talk a lot about whether some wars are just and some aren't just, but this one is an absolutely unequal conflict. In one hand, you mentioned at the beginning, you have an Israeli state that has been using really advanced drones, artillery, and what, like Amar said, on the other hand, and Fabrice, this youth that uses basically stones in their own body, whether to do hunger strikes or to be used as bombs. What's true is that where we are today, Israel should be condemned because it's violating international law, and it's been doing more and more. And what's so sad is that in front of our eyes, we see a population, a country that's just like after the Oslo agreements, that's just Palestinians are losing and doing all their best in order to stay and to stand.
Nico Heinz, we see as well Israel torn apart. It seems to be a two-track approach by this government. A hard line when it comes to the Palestinians, and that judicial overhaul, which for now is on pause, but it's just a pause.
Yeah, and of course, for certain elements within Netanyahu's government, this is exactly what they want. They want tensions to be flaring. They want the escalation to be getting worse and worse. The United Nations finally came out this morning and said that this was spiraling out of control. Well, for certain people within that coalition government, that's exactly what they want, because like the clip we heard, it gives them an excuse to be even harsher, to force through some of these even stricter rules. Because when people in the country see flames and they see conflict and they see dead bodies, they're going to be much more tolerant of strict, hardline rules that the government can try and enforce. So this is all part of the plan, and that's the really, really scary thing.
Time now to report on a toast among teetotalers. Joe Biden feting India's prime minister at a White House banquet, part of Narendra Modi's first state visit to Washington. Downplayed lectures on democratic backsliding in India, celebrated trade and defense ties, as well as the rise of an Indian diaspora that's more than 4 million strong, with, for instance, the late mother of U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, born in India, welcoming India's prime minister. It's about domestic politics these days in America.
Yeah, it's about a couple of things, but it's about two main things in that case. First of all, I have to say that Modi was delighted. I mean, to have such a state visit, it looked. I mean, if you look at this, the pictures of the whole visit, he's smiling all the time, and you have to remember that leader has been criticized a lot for.
He couldn't get a visa a few years back.
Exactly. For basically having some kind of very hard line. Euphemism, nationalism, Indian nationalism in India. Attempt against human rights, freedom of the press. Religious minorities as well. So he's been very happy. But for the U.S., there's two things there. The first one is. They got this opportunity with Modi in Washington to basically try to move him away from the Russian sphere. I mean, we know that India is getting a lot of arms and military aid from Russia, so that's one point to be made. India was also benefiting a lot from the low prices of oil and gas from Russia. So so that's one thing. And the other thing is China. Obviously, Biden is trying to take advantage of this long standoff between India and China, with they share a long border. And so for Biden, it's like, okay, this is geopolitics, as usual, I would say. But the thing is, the puzzle of geopolitics has moved a lot, and since Ukraine, and all those middle-sized countries are also getting their voices heard, and Modi is taking advantage of that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Narendra Modi joining the rarefied club of world leaders who've been invited more than once for a joint session of Congress address. Modi garnering bipartisan applause in the U.S. Congress with his implicit digs at superpower rival China.
Mr. Speaker, the dark clouds of coercion and confrontation are casting their shadow in the Indo-Pacific. The stability of the region has become one of the central concerns of our partnership. We share a vision of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific.
A free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Nico Hines, that veiled reference to China, accompanied also by something which is quite historic. The U.S. agreeing to build jet fighter engines in India. General Electric got the deal. It's moving sensitive technology to a country that officially is not an ally of the United States as such.
Yeah, well, I think very often if you look at the military angle to these things, you get to see the real picture. And, you know, traditionally, India relied on Russia to supply its weaponry, its munitions. And since, I think it was up until 2005, 80% of India's military imports came from Russia. And now, just a few years later, the majority come from the United States. And I think that shows how the US has been able to wean India off of its reliance of Russia. And that's a really crucial strategic goal. You know, it's just this year that India has overtaken China as the biggest population in the world. They've still got a long way to go when it comes to military and economic might, but India is the coming power. China potentially will start to dwindle away as its economy struggles with the aging population. And so the United States wants to position itself to be on the side that is coming strong, even if they're not quite as free and open as Modi made out when he was speaking to Congress.
I'm Robert Rabo. Is this the beginning of a beautiful alliance, or is this just transactional? You know,
it's probably transaction, but what I see mainly is the signal that is sent to other places in the world where people who have, let's say, the same profile or the same background as Modi in terms of nationalism or in terms of dealing with minorities,
his anti-Muslim rhetoric,
anti-Muslim rhetoric, etc. They have a huge signal of a green light, like it's not a problem for us. You know, you're welcome. While on the other hand, we are very tough on Orban or other people who share the same ideology, more or less.
On this very set, by the way, Aishugul, sir, you'll be interested to hear this on Thursday.
I'm afraid what you're going to say.
We had a guest saying India is not at all like Turkey. It is a democracy. Look at recent, this was a Modi supporter, look at recent local elections where the ruling BJP got kicked out of power.
François Picard, are you provoking me? Well, the thing that Amar mentioned is true, is that in a way it's saying countries like, Hungary and Turkey, are they democracies or are they authoritarian regimes? And that's very interesting. It's the same thing we call right now India a democracy, but is it really a democracy with everything going on? Which is kind of the faux pas that President Biden did this week, of Anthony Blinken spending so many, hours trying to make the relations between China, a democracy, and an autocracy, a dictatorship. And right when he came back, President Biden calling, I think it was yesterday, China or Xi Jinping a dictator.
Well, let's talk about that. Earlier in the week, there was fury in Beijing. The U.S. president, it was a campaign reception in California, branded Xi a dictator. This, the same week when the Chinese hosted Biden's, as Aishugul was saying, Biden's Secretary of State.
We had an incident that caused some confusion, you might say. But the Secretary Blinken had a great trip to China. I expect to be meeting with President Xi sometime in the future, in the near term, and I don't think it's had any real consequence.
So there you go, case closed, Aishugul.
What can I say? But I can say something. It's very interesting of how we forget that we are right now in France. France is hosting on what, July 14, the Bastille Day. Who is the guest of honor? Modi. So in a way, all these superpowers, all these countries are trying to charm Modi. But Modi is actually quite, not that I know him personally, but he's quite smart in the sense of he's not cutting his ties with Russia, with Iran, and with China, despite the fact that they've been, they've had confrontations in the past, but he's also accepts to be treated and welcomed in France and in the US as the kingmaker in a way.
Excuse me, Fabrice Rousselot, for crudely speaking about money, but the French are trying to sell marine Rafales to the Indians.
I think it has something to do with it. But I was about to say, this debate we had about China for like 70 years. Remember about, should we engage with China? Is this a dictatorship? And now the problem is most of those regimes are in between. Turkey. I'm not going to talk about Turkey, but you can ask a question. You can ask a question about India. You can ask, MBS was here all week, Saudi Arabia. So now the question is, okay, how do we address those regimes? Do we decide that we don't deal with them at all, except that they have a lot of power in terms of economy, in terms of business, and in terms now also in geopolitics. So what we're seeing is we're seeing the West all of a sudden, depending on the situation, changing their words and President Biden seems confused himself about the whole incident. It's been a bit confusing. So, of course, they are confused because if they talk in private, they call them dictators. Mm-hmm. But if they receive them in Congress, they applaud them. So that's an issue.
All right, a very different tone when it comes to China from France's president. Emmanuel Macron hosting the Chinese prime minister and praising Li Qiang for attending a major climate finance summit here in Paris, where, for instance, Macron hailed on the sidelines a debt restructuring deal for Zambia, much needed for a country in default. Macron also talked up sustainable lending to avoid future debt traps.
France is playing a key role, and we need to have sustainable financing models. If you cancel the debt, that means nobody will lend in future. If you tell the lenders, well, we're cancelling all the debt. Since these are models that are not self-financing, well, good luck if you want to find people to lend money. We said to the Chinese, look, you have to join us for the global framework. We applied the global framework to Chad and now for Zambia.
Nico Hines, you hear that? We're not going back to the days of Tony Blair with the millennial goals and when there was all that debt relief. What he's saying instead is that we're going to have to work with basically all the countries that do have funding to do what he's called sustainable lending.
Yeah, I do think there's been some quite interesting thoughts bubbling up from these meetings this week. One of the ideas is that perhaps the fundamental problem is if you're a poor country, it's going to cost you an awful lot more to do anything to do with infrastructure. Say, for example, you wanted to build a new solar power plant, which is exactly what we need to combat the climate change issues. If you're a poor country and you need to borrow $1 billion in order to be able to build all of this infrastructure in your country, it's going to cost you an awful lot more than it would cost, say, France to build the exact same infrastructure plant because of the huge high cost of borrowing for that country. Because for reasonable reasons, lenders don't think it's safe to give that money to that country. So I do think trying to combat that by thinking about ways around it are very, very important. One of the proposals that's been kicking around this week is to say that the World Bank should come in as the guarantor if it's an infrastructure project that's going to aid environmentalism. And I think that could potentially be a very good idea. I know we haven't got to a lot of big solutions that have been signed off this week, but at least some of these ideas are being explored and some of these great minds around the world are coming up with ideas. And I think the idea of redrawing the World Bank and the IMF, which was set up after the Second World War in a very, very different situation, trying to redraw those financial institutions to actually be helpful to the developing world in the 21st century is a fantastic, really, really important idea. And hopefully one day these ideas can actually come to fruition.
Amar Abed-Rabo?
One of the ideas I heard also was about getting the private sector also to help and to lend money. But when we see that already with 60 or 70 years of this system of World Bank, IMF, etc., the huge problems of debt that were just mentioned now, and these are related to politics. So sometimes some debt are released, some erased or released or things like that. So if you have the private sector, you won't have this flexibility, let's say. It might be much more tough.
Yeah, Zambia is a case of where there was some dodgy private lenders that were part of the problem.
Exactly. So I don't see it as a solution. I see it as adding to the problem. I think this whole thing, I mean, it's very personal, but it was probably like a diplomatic test for President Macron to see who are his friends and who would come, take the pain, etc.
Photo op, Fabrice Rousselot?
Yeah, I was just, Nico is right. Those are great ideas, but that's a problem too. They are only ideas. I mean, what I think was lacking in that summit is some kind of sense of urgency. Zambia got something out of it, but there's like 55 other countries are in default and it needed to be solved. Reforming the IMF and the World Bank, it's a great idea, but it's going to take years and years.
And if you recapitalize, you need the United States to sign off
exactly.
on that. They're the main shareholder.
They won't do that. I mean, the whole 100 billion aid that they kind of committed to. I'm sorry to say, but there was 100 billion in 2009, in 2015, and now again. So I think this is a great thing. Maybe, it's a great thing to have a summit. It's a great thing to have the media and cover it and everything else. But if you don't take concrete steps and it doesn't lead to something that is very concrete for those countries, then it doesn't serve any purpose.
I should go, sir.
See, I am kind of losing faith in all these summits more and more. But the thing that
Macron likes hosting them.
Yes, Macron likes a lot of things. It doesn't mean he has grand ideas. And one of the things that is not a grand idea of Monsieur Emmanuel Macron is that he has been also this week trying to ban some environmental activists of some groups. And I think that's, for me, at least I think it has drawn my attention more than this summit, I must say, in terms of calling, the Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin calling eco-demonstrators eco-terrorists, and in a country where France, we were talking about India, trying to promote itself as the country of human rights and freedom of expression, to ban, organizations that are actually organizations who sometimes are not even NGOs, but people's own efforts in trying to bring light to the problem of the climate issue, and to ban them like this, and to say that this is not an issue of freedom of expression, it's violence, but actually it's this country's own police that has been using a lot of violence, I think, in the past few weeks and months against demonstrators of climate. That is something that we ought to talk about more than, again, billions of dollars that are being promised and never delivered.
It's kind of a domestic issue. The government banning this collective. It's a collective called Uprisings of the Earth over recent clashes. Ban demonstrations that still went forth. It's unclear, though, whether this ban, Amar Abed-Rabo, is going to stand in the courts. Human Rights Watch accuses France of shooting the messenger here.
I agree with Ashigulu. It's a problem coming from the country of human rights, as very often France markets itself.
Why are they doing it? Because Emmanuel Macron, doesn't that lose him votes when he bans an environmentalist group?
Because you have an interior, there is not you, of course, François Picard. This country has an interior,
he is my interior minister, whether I like it or not.
That has been a lot about trying to promote police, and by promoting police, by calling civilians violent and sorry, I interrupted you, but.
I was going to say that. So
No. I mean, you have to understand.
What's the calculus here?
The calculus is it's a political decision only to please the right and everything else. Macron has chosen his side. I mean, when he was re-elected, people were saying, okay, which way is he going to go? Is he going to go to trying to attract some of the left? Is he going to try to attract? definitely chosen his side. And on this issue, it's a political decision. And I think it's a disastrous one because it's going to lead to more demonstration. It's going to lead to more, a movement and everything else. And the other thing I want to mention is, how is it that in France, when we talk about ecology, we have to come to violence on both sides? And that's a problem. If we can't talk to people about, ecology, or those issues, which are real issues.
Are you saying that it's both sides that are violent?
Oh, well, the movement, the soulèvement de la terre in French, they have been, accused of some violence, and there's a judicial path for this. They should go to court. They shouldn't be dissolved as a movement. But there's been also, France has been criticized for the response of the police, which is true, and there's some, investigations going on. So my problem is, those issues are concerning for French people. Why are they become so violent? And why do we only talk about violence? That shouldn't be the case. And that's a problem for democracy.
Sitting across the channel, Nico Hines, is this just a French issue? This you need to be violent to get the attention of the cameras? Or are people more violent? Or is there a debate over how you win over public opinion? I know where you are. You have people who glue themselves to roads and throw tomato juice at paintings.
Yeah, so I think there's different ways to get the attention of the cameras, isn't there? The old-fashioned way is to cause a riot and have something on fire because a flaming orange picture will always look good on the front of a newspaper or on the TV channels. And then there's another way of doing it, which is to try and be more inventive, more crazy. There was a thing at the World Snooker Finals where Just Stop Oil came in, jumped onto the table in the middle of the snooker game, and everyone tutted and said how appalling this was. But lo and behold, the next day, on the back of all the newspapers, there was this image of the guy with the Just Stop Oil T-shirt. And so it's always been the case that in order to get the attention that you need for your cause, you need to go so far that the majority of people think you've gone too far. And so there's always that tension, I think. You go back 100 years and the suffragettes were being called terrorists and crazy, stupid women who were taking things too far. Well, perhaps, but they were at the forefront of a movement. And I think it's really important that we remember that it's for all of us that these climate protesters are going a bit too far, are changing the conversation and are getting the message out there.
And are people getting that, Nico?
Well, I think the more people hear the message, the more they realise that it's something that's become part of the mainstream. And there's been some interesting polling recently. Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the opposition Labour Party and is currently the favourite to become the next Prime Minister, has suddenly started talking a lot more about green issues. And that's because it turns out that voters actually do want to hear green proposals that are going to improve our situation in the future. And so I think eventually, bit by bit, and this is a kind of a generational thing, I'm sure, as the younger generation gets older, it matures into a voting age, they do want plans in place right now to secure their future so that they can live to be middle-aged like us.
Did you just call us middle-aged, Nico Hines?
We've been talking about dissonance throughout this show in what our political leaders want, what perhaps their constituents want. You had the French president talking up green initiatives, but also this week championing big industry, arriving at the Paris Air Show in an H-160 French military helicopter. The French president who played salesman for military hardware and for Airbus passenger planes. There were orders of some 500 for just one Indian domestic airliner. Ahmed, you were at the Paris Air Show, and
Yes.
they talked up the fact that they're going to try to go green and have
Exactly.
green fuel by the year 2050, but of course that's a long ways away.
It's a very long way. The problem with these issues is that, as Nick said, it's the voters on local elections. They go green more and more. In France, there are cities that are ruled by the Greens. But then there's too much violence, it's too noisy and you cannot hear the message sometimes. But to go back to Le Bourget, if Macron didn't sell the airplanes or didn't do the show or didn't go that far, people would also be angry after him. I mean, it's also part of his job to promote something like Airbus, that is a French and European monument, and that, he should be also a salesman for Airbus.
There's been record amounts of airline tickets sold this summer while we're all clamoring for a radical change to go greener. Let he or she who's not booked an airline ticket this summer cast the first stone. Fabrice Rousselot.
I haven't booked yet, but I will. No, but that's the question of people are concerned about all those green issues and obviously what's going to happen to the planet. At the same time, on a day-to-day level, some people don't do the job, but also they don't do the job because what we said earlier, because that dialogue about those issues is not there. If we see only people screaming at each other, if we see Macron going to the Bourget on one side, promoting ecology on the other, and dissolving a movement in the middle, what's the logic to all of this? So I think people need to understand the issues better. It's a responsibility of the media. It's responsibility of the government. It's responsibility of the citizens. So everybody should get together. At the moment, it's kind of a brouhaha, as we say in French. It's all mixed up, and nobody understands what they should do or shouldn't do, and that's a problem.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Fabrice Rousselot. I want to thank Aishikul Sert, Amar Abed Rabo, Nico Hines in London. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.